Nolan was digging in his backyard, preparing to plant a new tree when his shovel hit something hard. Clearing the dirt away, he uncovered an old, tarnished necklace. Intrigued, Nolan took it to a local jeweler, expecting it to be a simple piece of costume jewelry. But when the jeweler examined it, his hands trembled and his eyes widened in disbelief. "This can't be real," the jeweler muttered, clutching the necklace tightly. Nolan's curiosity turned to unease. He had hoped the necklace might be worth something, maybe enough to buy the new shovel he'd been eyeing. But the jeweler's reaction was unsettling. But before we dive into the story, make sure to smash that like button, hit subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our exciting stories. "You have no idea what you found, do you?" the jeweler asked, his voice low and serious. Before Nolan could respond, the jeweler stepped back and reached for his phone. "This needs to be seen by someone else," he said, calling someone urgently. Nolan tried to get the necklace back, but the jeweler refused. "This piece doesn't belong to you," he added cryptically, tightening his grip on the necklace. Frustrated and uneasy, Nolan jumped over the counter to confront the jeweler. Why was the necklace so important? Who was the jeweler calling? Despite his growing anxiety, Nolan couldn't leave without understanding the mystery behind the strange piece of jewelry he just unearthed. Minutes earlier, Nolan had been excited about planting a new apple tree beside his pear tree, but now he stood in the jeweler's shop, waiting for answers he wasn't sure he wanted. Nolan watched in silence as the jeweler finished his phone call, not offering any explanations. The once excited feeling of potentially finding something valuable was now replaced by dread. The jeweler instructed everyone in the shop to leave immediately, creating an awkward atmosphere as customers glanced at each other before shuffling out the door. The jeweler locked the door behind them, leaving Nolan alone in the shop with him. The room felt smaller, heavier, as tension hung in the air. "What's going on?" Nolan muttered, trying to keep calm. The jeweler didn't respond, his focus still on the necklace, as if it held some dark secret. Nolan's patience began to wear thin. "I deserve to know what's happening," he insisted, stepping closer. The jeweler shook his head. "Not until the specialist arrives." Nolan couldn't understand the gravity of the situation, but felt more uneasy with each passing minute. He quickly sent a text to his friend Olaf, explaining what had happened and asking him to come to the shop. Moments later, Nolan's phone buzzed with Olaf's response. "On my way." Feeling slightly reassured that help was coming, Nolan tried to stay calm, but the room's silence was suffocating. Each tick of the clock made him more anxious, while the jeweler continued fiddling with his tools as if nothing was wrong. When Olaf arrived and tried to enter, the jeweler refused to let him in. "He's my friend," Olaf argued through the glass, pointing at Nolan. The jeweler shook his head firmly, refusing to open the door. Olaf banged on the door, his frustration growing, while Nolan felt more trapped inside, wondering what he had gotten himself into. Suddenly, a man in sunglasses entered the shop, ignoring Olaf's protests. He strode in with authority, and the jeweler immediately acknowledged him. "This is the specialist," the jeweler explained. The man ignored Olaf entirely, and Nolan's sense of dread deepened. Something wasn't right, and he was beginning to regret ever digging in his backyard. The man in sunglasses wasted no time. He confidently walked over to the counter where the necklace lay and picked it up, examining it closely. Nolan watched, his heart pounding as the stranger turned the piece over in his hands, inspecting every detail. The jeweler hovered nearby, his face pale and tense, as if waiting for a verdict. Nolan's mind raced. What was so important about this necklace? He glanced outside, seeing Olaf still banging on the glass, trying to get in. "Let him in," Nolan shouted. But the jeweler ignored him, continuing to speak in hushed tones with the man in sunglasses. Nolan felt increasingly isolated and helpless. His mind was filled with questions, but no one seemed willing to give him answers. Just as he was about to grab his phone to call for help, the man in sunglasses snatched it from his hand. "No calls," the man said firmly. slipping the phone into his pocket. Nolan's fear spiked, and he glanced nervously at the jeweler, who stood calmly, almost as if he had anticipated this all along. Suddenly, two large men appeared, locking the door and pulling a bewildered Olaf inside. "Hey, what's going on?" Olaf protested, struggling against their grip as they forced him to stand beside Nolan. The shop felt even smaller now, the tension thick as the burly men stood guard. The man in sunglasses seemed completely in control, ignoring Nolan and Olaf's growing panic. He handed the necklace back to the jeweler, who held it with reverence. "We need to see where this was found," the man said flatly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Take us to your backyard," he added, staring directly at Nolan. Nolan felt a wave of helplessness wash over him. He glanced at Olaf, who looked just as anxious, but there was no choice. "Do I have a choice?" Nolan asked weakly. The man's silence was his answer. With no other option, Nolan reluctantly agreed to lead them to his backyard. The group moved outside, the setting sun casting long, ominous shadows as they headed toward Nolan's garden. The man grabbed a shovel, his movements deliberate as if he already knew what he was looking for. As they reached Nolan's backyard, the man in sunglasses immediately took charge, grabbing a shovel and beginning to dig where Nolan had found the necklace. The sun was setting, casting a dim light over the garden, and Nolan's heart sank as he watched the scene unfold. Olaf stood beside him, sharing his concern. "This is insane," Olaf muttered, his eyes wide with disbelief. Nolan felt torn as he watched the men dig. His once peaceful garden, carefully tended over the years, was being torn apart by strangers. Each shovel full of dirt felt like a personal loss, but there was nothing he could do to stop it. "They're going to destroy everything," Nolan whispered, his voice barely audible. The man in sunglasses dug with precision, as if he knew exactly what he was looking for. Nolan and Olaf stood helpless, their anxiety growing with every movement of the shovel. The other men remained on guard, watching the surroundings carefully, making sure no one interrupted. Suddenly, the man stopped digging and began excavating the soil with his hands, brushing it away carefully. Nolan and Olaf exchanged puzzled glances, wondering what had prompted the change. The other men watched intently, their expressions serious. Then, to everyone's shock, the man unearthed a gold ring that matched the necklace. The ring gleamed in the fading light, its intricate design unmistakably linked to the necklace Nolan had found. "No way," Nolan breathed, his eyes wide with disbelief. The man held the ring up, examining it closely. "This changes everything," the man muttered, his voice filled with a sense of importance. The discovery seemed to raise the stakes even further, and the tension in the air thickened. Nolan, trying to break the oppressive atmosphere, offered the men refreshments. "Would you guys like something to drink?" he asked, his voice shaky but polite. The men exchanged glances and nodded. "Water would be good," the man in sunglasses replied. Olaf raised an eyebrow at Nolan, surprised by his sudden hospitality. "What are you doing?" Olaf whispered as they walked back inside the house to get the drinks. "Why are you being so nice to them?" Nolan sighed, rubbing his temples. "I'm just trying to keep things calm," he explained. "Maybe if we're nice, they'll explain what's going on." Olaf frowned, but nodded. "Okay, but let's be quick," he said, glancing nervously back toward the garden. They hurried to grab water, their hands trembling with unease. As Nolan and Olaf returned to the garden with glasses of water, they were interrupted by a sudden shout. "Get out here, quick!" The man in sunglasses called out, his voice sharp and urgent. Nolan and Olaf exchanged alarmed looks before rushing back outside, their hearts pounding. When they arrived, they found the man kneeling on the ground, his hands full of glinting objects. Nolan's eyes widened in disbelief as he realized what was in the man's hands: more jewelry and gold coins. A small pile of ornate items, more dazzling than the last, glittered in the dim light. "This is incredible," Nolan muttered, barely able to believe what he was seeing. Olaf, bent down beside him, his eyes wide with astonishment. "Where did all of this come from?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The man in sunglasses stood up, his expression triumphant. "And there's more where this came from," he said confidently, clearly pleased with the discovery. Overwhelmed by the sight of so much treasure, Nolan barely heard him. The man declared that they would need to continue digging the entire garden. "We need to search every inch," he announced, his tone firm and unwavering. Nolan's heart raced as he imagined the potential wealth buried beneath the soil. But at the same time, a sense of dread filled him. His garden, his sanctuary, was about to be torn apart. "Are you sure?" Nolan asked, his voice shaky, a mix of hope and fear. The man nodded firmly. "Absolutely. We can't stop now." The promise of more treasure was intoxicating, blinding Nolan to the devastation happening in his garden. "Okay, do it," Nolan said, barely recognizing his own voice as he agreed. His dreams of wealth were already taking shape in his mind, despite the destruction around him. Olaf gave him a worried glance but remained silent, sensing that there was no stopping what was happening. The men began marking out areas for further excavation, their energy renewed by the possibility of more treasures. Nolan stood in stunned silence, watching as the garden he had nurtured for years was transformed into a chaotic dig site. The plants he had cared for were being uprooted, the soil churned without any regard for the years of work he had put into it. "It's for the best," he whispered to himself, trying to justify the destruction as he held on to the hope that the riches they were uncovering would change everything. The digging continued, and with each new discovery, golden bracelets, ancient coins, ornate brooches, Nolan's excitement grew. His mind raced with visions of his life transformed by this unexpected fortune. As the excavation progressed, Nolan's excitement was palpable. Each new treasure they unearthed fueled his dreams of wealth and success. Golden bracelets, ancient coins, and ornate brooches were uncovered in rapid succession, each piece more dazzling than the last. Nolan's eyes shone with anticipation, imagining how these discoveries could change his life forever. "This is unbelievable," Nolan whispered to Olaf, who nodded, equally amazed. The men continued digging with renewed vigor, their enthusiasm infectious. Nolan's heart raced with every glittering find, his thoughts consumed by the possibilities. After uncovering a significant number of items, Nolan finally spoke up, his mind shifting to what this all meant for him. "So, how does this work?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "What do I get from all this?" The man in sunglasses glanced at the jeweler, who chuckled softly, almost as if they had anticipated Nolan's question. "We need to discuss that," the jeweler said, his tone light but with an edge of finality. Nolan felt a wave of unease wash over him. "But I found it on my property," he added, trying to assert his claim. The jeweler smiled faintly and began to explain the historical significance of the treasures they were unearthing. "These aren't just ordinary valuables," the jeweler began, his voice carrying an almost amused tone. "They're part of a lost collection from the 18th century. Nolan's eyes widened. "What does that mean?" he asked, his excitement now mixed with confusion. The jeweler sighed, as if preparing to deliver bad news. "It means," he continued, "that these items are priceless artifacts with immense historical value. By law, they belong to the state." Nolan's heart sank. "So, I get nothing?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, the weight of the revelation hitting him all at once. The jeweler nodded, though there was a trace of sympathy in his eyes. "I'm afraid so," he said softly. Nolan stood there in shock, his dreams of riches shattered. All this time, he had imagined a new life, filled with luxury and comfort. But now, it was slipping through his fingers. The treasure that he had found wasn't his to claim. It belonged to history, not him. Olaf placed a comforting hand on Nolan's shoulder. "At least it'll be preserved for history," he offered quietly, though the words did little to ease Nolan's profound disappointment. Nolan nodded numbly, trying to process the harsh reality. The treasure was destined for a museum, not his pockets, and all his dreams of wealth were gone in an instant. Nolan stood there in stunned silence, struggling to come to terms with the revelation. All of his hopes and dreams, fueled by the discovery of the treasure, had evaporated in a matter of minutes. He felt a deep sense of loss, not just for the fortune that had slipped away, but for the hard work and care he had put into his garden, now reduced to a chaotic dig site. "I can't believe this," Nolan muttered, his voice filled with disbelief. His fingers itched to call the police, desperate to regain some control over the situation. He managed to retrieve his phone from the man in sunglasses and quickly dialed 911, his hands trembling as he explained the bizarre situation. "Please hurry," he urged, glancing nervously at the men still digging through his garden. Olaf stood by silently, his face grim as he watched the events unfold. Moments later, the police arrived, and Nolan felt a flicker of hope. Maybe they could help him make sense of this mess. The officers listened carefully as the jeweler explained the situation, showing them the artifacts that had been uncovered. After inspecting the treasure, one of the officers nodded solemnly. "These appear to be authentic historical artifacts," he said, confirming the jeweler's claim. Nolan's heart sank further as the officer continued. "By law, these items are considered state property and must be handed over to the government. They're part of a lost royal collection." Nolan felt a wave of disappointment wash over him again. "So, I really get nothing?" he asked, his voice cracking. "I'm afraid not," the officer replied sympathetically. The finality in his words made the situation even harder to bear. Nolan's dreams of wealth were gone, replaced by the cold reality that the treasure would never be his. The officers, the jeweler, and the mysterious man worked together to pack up the artifacts, carefully placing each piece in protective cases. Nolan watched in silence, his heart heavy with loss. Olaf stood beside him, offering silent support as they watched the treasures, once briefly his, be carried away to a museum. After the officers completed their investigation, they confirmed that everything had been handled according to the law. "It's over," one of the officers said gently to Nolan, sensing his devastation. Nolan nodded, feeling numb. "I just thought maybe this could change everything," he muttered, the weight of reality crushing any lingering hopes he had. There was nothing left for him to do but watch as the treasures were taken away. As the men prepared to leave, the jeweler offered Nolan a few words of thanks for his cooperation, though the sentiment felt hollow. "Thank you for understanding," the jeweler said quietly, before turning to leave with the others. Nolan stood alone in his now ruined garden, the once vibrant space now a mess of torn-up soil and scattered roots. Olaf placed a hand on his shoulder, offering a few last words of comfort. "You did the right thing," Olaf said softly. Nolan tried to smile, but couldn't find the strength. "Yeah, I guess," he replied weakly, though his heart wasn't in it. After a while, Olaf quietly left, giving Nolan space to process everything. Nolan stood there for a moment longer, staring at the destruction of his garden and reflecting on the whirlwind of emotions he had gone through that day. It was hard to believe that the treasures had been his, even for a brief time, and now they were gone, leaving him with nothing but a ruined garden and shattered dreams. Later, Nolan received a modest check in the mail, sent by the treasure hunters as a gesture of goodwill. It was intended to cover the costs of restoring his garden. The check came in a plain envelope, accompanied by a brief note of apology. Nolan stared at the check, feeling a mixture of gratitude and sadness. It wasn't much, but it was something. As he stood by the window, Looking out at his ruined garden, Nolan sighed deeply. The dreams he had once nurtured along with his plants were gone, but maybe, just maybe, he could rebuild, starting with the garden that had brought him so much joy before everything changed.